Eric Dolphy was born Eric Allen Dolphy Jr. on June 20th, 1928, in Los Angeles, California. He was raised in LA as an only child. Eric's parents were Sadie and Eric Dolphy Sr., who immigrated from Panama. Eric Jr. began music lessons at age 6, studying clarinet and saxophone privately. While in junior high, he began to study the oboe, aspiring to a professional symphonic career, receiving a 2-year scholarship to study at the music school of the University of Southern California. At age 13, he received a Superior Award on clarinet from the California School Board and Orchestra Festival. Eric attended Dorsey High School, where he continued his musical studies and learned additional instruments. By 1946, Eric was the co-director of the youth choir at the Westminster Presbyterian Church, ran by Reverend Hampton B. Hawes, father of the jazz pianist of the same name. Eric graduated in 1947, then attended Los Angeles City College, during which time he played contemporary classical works such as Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat, along with Jimmy Knepper and Art Farmer, performed with Roy Porter's 17 Beboppers. Eric went on to make 8 recordings with Porter by 1949. On these early sessions, Eric played baritone saxophone, alto sax, soprano clarinet, and flute. In 1950, Eric joined the Army and was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. In 1952, Eric attended the Navy School of Music. In 1953, he was discharged, then returned to Los Angeles. He worked with many musicians such as Buddy Collette, Eddie Beale, and Gerald Wilson, who was later referred to as GW. Later on, there was a track dedicated to GW, which appeared on the album Outward Bound. Eric often had friends come by to jam, enabled by the fact that his father had made a makeshift studio for him in the family backyard. Records made in 1954 with Clifford Brown document this early period. Eric lived with his parents nearly all his life. He always had a car and would drive his bandmates or other people he knew to shows. There'd be times where he'd think that he had a job, only to find that there wasn't one, or it was given to someone else. If someone was asked if this upset him, he'd always tell them that it didn't, especially when the jobs were given to other musicians that had families to support. Eric's big splash came when he was invited to join Chico Hamilton's quintet in 1958 at the Newport Jazz Festival. With the group, he became known to a wider audience and was able to tour extensively through 1958 through 59, when he left Hamilton's group and moved to New York City. Dolphy appears with Hamilton's band in the film Jazz on a Summer's Day, playing flute during the Newport Jazz Festival of 1958. One article states that Eric's reputation grew when he started freelancing around NYC. An interview with his parents confirmed that Eric was a freelancer. Eric had a huge discography playing with musicians of all kinds, with big names such as Charles Mingus, John Coltrane, and Booker Little. Eric and Charles Mingus had known each other from growing up in Los Angeles. Eric joined Mingus's workshop in 1960, shortly after arriving in New York. He took part in Mingus's big band recording Pre-Bird and is featured on Bemoanable Lady. He later joined Mingus's working band at the Showplace during 1960, which was memorialized in the poem Mingus at the Showplace by William Matthews. Eric also appeared on the Leader's 2 Candid label albums, Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus, and Mingus. Dolphy, Mingus said, was a complete musician. He could fit anywhere. He was a fine lead alto in a big band. He could make it in a classical group. And of course, he was entirely his own man when he soloed. He had mastered jazz, and he had mastered all the instruments he played. In fact, he knew more than was supposed to be possible to do on them. That same year, 1960, Dolphy took part in the Mingus-led Jazz Artist Guild project and its Newport Rebels recording session. In 1961, he toured with Mingus in Europe. Dolphy also continued to perform as a solo artist, where he recorded in Scandinavia and Berlin. Some of the records from this include the Berlin concerts, the complete Uppsala concert, and the Stockholm sessions. Eric was later among the musicians who worked on Mingus's 1963 album, Mingus, 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 and is featured on Hora Decubitus. In early 1964, Eric returned to Mingus's working band, now including Jackie Bayard, Johnny Coles, and Clifford Jordan. The group worked at the Five Spot, which was a jazz cafe from that time period, then played at Cornell University and the Town Hall in New York, the former two venues having their performances recorded. The short tour is well documented on Revenge, a 1964 live album, The Great Concert of Charles Mingus, and Mingus in Europe, Volumes 1 and 2. Eric and John Coltrane knew each other long before they formally played together, where they had met in Los Angeles, where Coltrane was with Johnny Hodges in 1954. Coltrane and Dolphy would often exchange ideas and learn from each other. Eventually, after many nights sitting in with Coltrane's band, Eric was asked to become a full-time member in 1961. Coltrane had gained an audience and critical notice with Miles Davis's quintet, but some leading jazz critics were alienated when he began to move away from hard bop. Many critics have described Eric Dolphy and Coltrane and their type of group as being avant-garde. Although Coltrane's quintets with Dolphy are now accepted, they originally provoked Downbeat magazine to brand Coltrane and Dolphy's music as anti-jazz. Coltrane later said of this criticism, "They made it appear that we didn't even know the first thing about music. It hurt me to see Dolphy get hurt in this thing." Recordings from this time include Africa Brass, released on September 1st, 1961, and the complete 1961 Village Vanguard recordings, which was released in 1997. Trumpet player Booker Little and Eric Dolphy had a short-lived musical partnership. Little's later album, Out Front, featured Dolphy on alto sax mainly, though he played bass clarinet and flute on ensemble passages. In addition, Dolphy's album Far Cry, recorded for Prestige, featured Little on 5 tunes. Dolphy and Little also co-led a quintet at the Five Spot in 1961, the rhythm section consisting of Richard Davis, Mal Waldron, and Ed Blackwell. Booker Little died of uremia in 1961 at the age of 23. Eric went on to perform with a plethora of musicians, some including George Russell, Oliver Nelson, and Ornette Coleman. Dolphy's career as a recording leader began with the Prestige label. His association with them spanned 13 albums, recorded from April 1960 to September 1961. His first 2 albums were Outward Bound and Out There. Eric is recalled as having had a large musical collection, with 20th century classical music being a large portion. He owned scores by composers like Babbitt, Charles Ives, and Oliver Messiaen. Dolphy would also visit Edgar Varese at his home. In 1964, Eric signed with Blue Note Records and recorded Out to Lunch. After the album was recorded, Dolphy left for Europe with Mingus's 6-piece in early '64. Before a concert in Oslo, Eric told Mingus that he planned on staying in Europe after their tour was over, as he had become disillusioned with the U.S.'s reception to musicians who tried anything new. Eric had planned on settling with his fiancée, Joyce Mordecai, who had worked in the ballet scene in Paris. Before leaving for Europe in 1964, Eric had left papers and other personal effects with his friends Hale and Juanita Smith. Eventually, much of this was passed on to the musician James Newton. In May of 2014, 6 boxes of music papers were donated to the Library of Congress. There was an article snippet stating that Eric took his parents to the World's Fair of that year. On June 27, 1964, Eric traveled to Berlin to play with a trio by Carl Berger at the opening of a jazz club called The Tangent. When Eric first arrived in Europe, he was seriously ill, and during the first concert, he was barely able to play. Eric was hospitalized that night, but his condition worsened. On June 29th, Eric died after falling into a diabetic coma. While certain details of his death are disputed, it's largely accepted that he fell into a coma by undiagnosed diabetes. The liner notes to the Complete Prestige Recordings box set say that Dolphy collapsed in his hotel room in Berlin, and when brought to the hospital, he was diagnosed as being in a diabetic coma. After being administered a shot of insulin, he lapsed into insulin shock and died. A later documentary and liner notes dispute this, saying that Eric collapsed on stage in Berlin and was brought to a hospital. Allegedly, the attending hospital physicians did not know Dolphy was diabetic and someone that was actually drug-free. Instead, they assumed he was like the stereotype of jazz musicians, thinking that he had overdosed on drugs. In this account, he was left in a hospital bed for the drugs to run their course. Charles Mingus said, "Usually, when a man dies, you remember, or you say you remember, only the good things about him. With Eric, that's all you remember. I don't remember any drags he did to anybody. The man was absolutely without the need to hurt." Most news articles state that Eric died of a heart attack caused by a diabetic coma. It seems that the information about his diabetes came way late into his life, probably within those last few moments. People have said that Eric didn't know he was diabetic and was seen putting honey into his coffee just days before he passed away. The way his condition and death have been described, it seems to me that Eric may have been a type 1 diabetic, potentially spilling ketones in his last days. This is my speculation, but I assume that Eric was spilling ketones even before he got to Europe. Not knowing that he was diabetic, he lived as usual, not knowing that his body was unable to create its own insulin. This would cause his blood sugar to rise uncontrolled, and without help he passed out. And once again, this is just my own conjecture. One article had stated that Eric had been ill on arrival to Europe, and his diabetes was probably unknown to him. The doctors found too much sugar in his bloodstream, and the medical report stated that his death was attributed to a heart attack with a trace of diabetes. According to an article from the California Eagle, Charles Mingus essentially lost it at Eric's burial. Mingus apparently threw himself on the grave and cried. Their fellow musicians stated that Charles hadn't ever been as tight with anyone like he was with Dolphy. Eric Dolphy was buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery in Los Angeles, California. He was 36 years old. Eric's parents are also buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery. His mother, Sadie Clemencia Gillings, was born on March 19, 1907, in Limon, Costa Rica. She passed away on January 29, 1987, in Los Angeles. She was 79. Eric's father, Eric Allen Dolphy Sr., was born on February 6, 1903. He passed away on March 28, 1988, at age 85 in Los Angeles. I cannot find an obituary on any of them. Some article clippings mentioned Eric's death in passing, though it seems like as a whole, his death was not really put out there. Eric's parents were pretty easygoing and weren't bitter or angry after the loss. They believed that he had set out to do what he was meant to do in the world. Eric's music inspired those that played with him, and many musicians that came after. His influence was felt by his friends like Charles Mingus and John Coltrane, and by others like Frank Zappa, James Newton, and John Frusciante. Ironically, John Frusciante is how I got into Eric's music, as I had read a quote from him in the past. Anybody should go out and buy an Eric Dolphy record if they want to understand what pure expression is all about. John Frusciante, 1991. In an interview with his parents, they stated that Eric was just starting to gain recognition for his work when he passed away. This reflects in articles in the years since Eric's death, as many writers pondered how Eric's career would have went had he lived an average lifespan. With the releases of Eric's works posthumous, many people have been able to understand his versatility between instruments and the passion he had to play. In 1965, the Eric Dolphy Memorial Album was released. There are some sources online that list it was 1966, though I found an article that said 1965. In general, it seems that Eric wasn't recognized or thought of as a musical genius until after his death. This reminds me of the trope that an artist isn't recognized for their greatness until after death. With Eric, this situation is unintentional, though, since he died before many of his albums were able to even be released. There is an article from 1985 that showed Tony Trischka found Dolphy as an influence. In 1986, Horace Tapscott dedicated a performance to Eric at the Watts Towers Music and Arts Festival. He said, "The dedication and tribute will be to Eric and those that are still alive. We're trying to put that over because Eric's teachers and people who influenced him are still around here playing, alive and well. We shouldn't have to wait until these people have died before we start listening to their music. It seems so strange to me that you can reach out and touch somebody, but you can't wait until that seat is vacant before you reach out. Let's give the rose to those who can smell them now." Dolphy and Tapscott grew up in a group of tight musicians. Some included Frank Morgan, Lester Robertson, and Lawrence Marable, all who at the time of that article in 1986 were still alive. Another quote from Tapscott said, "You had all kind of instructors helping younger players, and Eric was one of many that came through here. He happened to be the one the writers caught hold to, that funny playing guy from California that Chico Hamilton brought to New York." Tapscott recalled that Eric was known for his improvisation, and though he is lauded now after death, Tapscott remembered that Eric was struggling before he passed. Eric was struggling as far as he was concerned, trying to work those gigs in New York and expand his musical knowledge. I do believe that had Eric been alive, he wouldn't have been listened to the way he's listened to now. You know that's not correct, but how do you go about changing it? That's what the tribute ought to be about. How do we go about changing these tributes under the circumstance that we are having them? In 1987, a memorial concert was held for Eric at the Los Angeles Press Club. Eric was remembered as a gifted jazz performer, one of the most gifted even from the post-World War II era, and some of those that performed were Buddy Collette and Fred Katz. That same year, the previously unreleased album Other Aspects was released. It was reviewed with acclaim, one writer pointing out that Eric was taken too soon, and his talent for composing music really shone through. To quote, "It is thought-provoking and stimulating, and shows that Dolphy did more than play riffs and search out gigs. He was a man who studied music, learned the discipline, and then interpreted it to his satisfaction." In a 1988 interview with Frank Zappa, he was asked about his upcoming tour, where it would have been a tribute to Eric Dolphy. Zappa said that he would be playing the Eric Dolphy Memorial Barbecue, which hadn't been performed in concert since 1969. This song is from Zappa's album Weasels Ate My Flesh. The song is a waltz that Zappa felt like had a dissonant harmony. Zappa was a fan of Dolphy's music, even back to when Eric was alive. In April of that year, the Boston Globe wrote an article about another tribute to Eric Dolphy, which was to be held at the Somerville Theater by composer Oliver Lake. I really wish that I could have added more or made this a much longer biography or story to talk about, but unfortunately, you can only go so far in a story about someone's life that was cut so short. I highly recommend taking a listen to Eric Dolphy's music, as there really was just so much passion and soul in everything he created. Thank you for listening to the story, and please check out Eric Dolphy's music. It might change your life.